Every year, millions of American families gather around tables filled with food to celebrate Thanksgiving. But the true story behind that tradition began inside a world shaped by hunger, disease, political uncertainty, and the collapse of entire indigenous communities long before most English settlers understood where they had arrived. Because the man standing at the center of the first Thanksgiving was not simply a friendly native helping lost pilgrims survive. He was a survivor of kidnapping. A man who had crossed the Atlantic years before the Mayflower. A man who had seen Europe with his own eyes. And a man who returned home only to discover that his entire world had already disappeared. His name was Tisquanum. The English called him Squanto. And without him, the story Americans now remember as Thanksgiving may never have happened at all. During the winter of 1620, freezing winds crossed the coast of New England, while exhausted survivors of the Mayflower quietly buried bodies beneath. Frozen ground, outside a fragile settlement that barely deserved to be called a colony. Disease spread through Plymouth, food supplies disappeared. Nearly half the passengers who had crossed the Atlantic together were already dead. And beyond the forests surrounding the settlement stretched a world the English still did not understand. Then something happened that must have seemed almost impossible. An indigenous man appeared speaking fluent English. For people who had only recently survived one of the harshest periods of their lives, the moment probably felt unreal. Standing before them was someone born somewhere along that same coastline who had already crossed the Atlantic years before they ever had. Today, most people remember him simply as the native connected to Thanksgiving. The interpreter who helped the Pilgrims survive. But the real story was far stranger. Long before Plymouth existed, Tisquanum had already been kidnapped by European traders, carried across the ocean against his will, nearly sold into slavery, exposed to the growing Atlantic world, and eventually returned home, only to discover that disease had erased the community where he had been born. Imagine surviving the destruction of your own world, and then helping another civilization establish itself on top of its ruins. That was the reality surrounding Plymouth during its earliest years. Because the English settlers had not arrived in an untouched wilderness waiting for occupation. They had arrived in a region already shaped by indigenous diplomacy, rivalries, alliances, and catastrophe. And somewhere beyond the forests surrounding Plymouth, indigenous leaders were already trying to decide whether those starving foreigners represented an opportunity, or the beginning of something much more dangerous. Years before the Mayflower ever crossed the Atlantic, the coastline of southern New England already belonged to a deeply interconnected indigenous world. Villages stood beside rivers and coastal inlets. Trade routes crossed forests generations before Europeans imagined permanent colonies there. Fishing canoes moved through Atlantic waters at sunrise, while families cultivated corn, beans, and squash beside longhouses exposed to the cold ocean wind. Among those peoples were the Patuxet. That was the community where Tisquanum was born. The Patuxet themselves were part of the larger Wampanoag world, a network of alliances and villages spread across the region whose survival depended on diplomacy, kinship, trade, and military balance between neighboring powers. One of the greatest concerns for Wampanoag leaders during that period were the Narragansett farther south, whose strength forced leaders like Massasoit to think carefully about long-term survival, years before permanent English settlements appeared nearby. And while those political tensions already shaped the region, another force also began appearing more frequently along the coast. European ships, at first, many arrived for fish. The North Atlantic contained enormous cod fisheries, and English, French, and Spanish vessels increasingly crossed the ocean, searching for profit. Some traded peacefully. Others mapped coastlines. Metal tools and fabrics slowly entered indigenous trade networks. But rumors traveled with those ships too. Kidnappings, violence, disappearing people, diseases nobody understood. For many indigenous communities, Europeans still looked less like future settlers and more like unpredictable visitors entering and leaving the coastline with the seasons. But even then, some leaders had already begun realizing how quickly the balance of the region could change. Once foreign ships started appearing regularly, Tisquanum grew up inside that unstable Atlantic world. As a young man, he likely watched European sails appear beyond the horizon, while elders discussed trade, danger, and opportunity around evening fires. And somewhere during those years, he probably began realizing that the ocean separating his world from Europe was no longer an impossible barrier. Something was crossing it, something growing larger every year. And before long, that changing Atlantic world would reach directly into his own life. Around 1614, an English explorer named Thomas Hunt arrived along the New England coastline, searching for profit in ways far darker than ordinary trade. Hunt had previously sailed beside John Smith, whose voyages helped convince English investors that North America might eventually support profitable colonies. But Hunt saw immediate value in something else: human cargo. Historical accounts differ in certain details, but what seems clear is that several indigenous men were lured aboard his ship before suddenly being captured. Among them was Tisquanum. One day he stood beside familiar Atlantic waters. The next, the coastline was disappearing behind him, while wooden walls closed around captives who no longer understood where they were being taken. For merchants inside the growing Atlantic economy, the ocean increasingly connected empires, markets, and colonies. For the prisoners trapped beneath Hunt's ship, it must have felt like the end of the world. When the vessel eventually reached Spain, Hunt appears to have intended to sell the captives into slavery. At that moment, Spain stood near the height of imperial power. Ships constantly crossed between Europe and the Americas carrying silver, goods, soldiers, priests, and enslaved people through one of the largest commercial systems on Earth. And somewhere inside that foreign world, Tisquan survived. Later accounts suggest Spanish friars intervened on behalf of some indigenous captives, though many details remain uncertain. What seems likely is that Tisquanum eventually traveled north toward England. And there, his life entered an entirely different phase. For years he lived among docks, warehouses, and crowded Atlantic ports, where the air smelled of salt, fish oil, wet rope, and smoke drifting from shipyards along the coast. He watched sailors unloading cod from Newfoundland, heard merchants arguing over storms, cargo, and profit, saw maps spread across wooden tables beside candlelight late into the night. Different languages moved through those ports around: hymn, English, Spanish. Fragments of distant worlds crossing the Atlantic together. Historical records suggest he eventually became connected to the commercial network of the English merchant John Slaney, whose business interests stretched through North Atlantic fisheries and Atlantic trade routes linking England to North America. Tisquanum learned English fluently. He became familiar with ships, navigation routes, and Atlantic commerce. And unlike many Europeans who would later arrive in New England, he understood both sides of that oceanic world. Somewhere during those years, Tisquanum stopped being simply a man from Patuxet. He became part of the Atlantic world itself, and when he finally secured passage back toward New England, near the end of the 1610s, he returned carrying knowledge very few people on either side of the Atlantic possessed. By the time Tisquanum finally returned to New England around 1619, years spent moving through European ports and Atlantic trade networks had transformed him into someone extraordinarily unusual for that period. A man capable of understanding both the indigenous world of coastal New England and the civilization now slowly advancing toward it across the Atlantic. For the first time since his capture, however, the ocean crossing carried hope. Years earlier, he had crossed as a prisoner. Now, he was finally going home. One can almost imagine the expectation growing inside him as the coastline slowly reappeared after years away. Somewhere beyond those forests stood the world he remembered from childhood: Patuxet, familiar voices, fields near the ocean, people who still existed in his memory exactly as they had before Thomas Hunt's ship carried him away. But while Tisquanum had been overseas, catastrophe had already swept across coastal New England, long before Plymouth existed. Long before most English settlers arrived, disease had already transformed the region. Modern historians still debate exactly which epidemic devastated the coastline between roughly 1616 and 1619. But whatever illness spread through the region, its effects permanently altered the balance of power throughout southern New England. Entire villages disappeared. Families vanished within only a few seasons. Trade networks collapsed. And when Tisclum finally returned to Patuxet territory, he encountered silence. Not the silence of an abandoned village, temporarily empty. A deeper silence, the kind left behind after a world disappears. Fields where families once cultivated corn now grew wild beneath the wind coming off the Atlantic. Homes slowly collapsed back into the earth. Pathways connecting generations of daily life vanished beneath grass and weather. Perhaps he searched for familiar faces among the ruins. Perhaps he called names no one answered. Perhaps he walked through the remains of Patuxet, trying to recognize the place where he had once belonged. His community was gone. That moment changed everything, because after walking through the ruins of Patuxet, Tisquanum no longer fully belonged to the world where he had been born, but neither had he become European. He had become something far more complicated. A man standing between civilizations while one world disappeared and another approached rapidly across the Atlantic. And it was during that fragile moment that another ship was making its way toward New England. The Mayflower. The people aboard the Mayflower did not see themselves as conquerors when they left Europe in 1620. Most were families shaped by years of religious tension inside England, where arguments surrounding the future of the English Church had divided communities for generations. Many believed the Church of England still carried too much influence from Catholic traditions, and over time some among them became convinced that true reform required separation not only in worship but in society itself. That belief eventually pushed part of the group to leave England and settle in the Dutch Republic, especially in the city of Leiden, where they hoped to practice their faith more freely. But even there, living among another culture and another language, many feared their children would slowly stop seeing themselves as English. The Atlantic began to look like an answer. If they could establish a settlement in North America, far from the political and religious struggles consuming Europe, perhaps they could build an entirely new community shaped according to their own beliefs. That was the hope they carried aboard the Mayflower. But hope did not make the crossing easier. Storms battered the ship repeatedly, while overcrowding, exhaustion, hunger and sickness spread through passengers trapped for weeks inside a vessel, never truly designed to transport entire families across an ocean. At times the sea became violent enough that some passengers reportedly believed the ship itself might break apart before ever reaching land. And when the coastline of New England finally appeared near the end of 1620, the world awaiting them looked nothing like the future they had imagined in Europe. Winter had already tightened across the coast. Freezing winds crossed forests they did not understand. Food rapidly diminished. Disease spread almost immediately inside the settlement. Many originally intended to settle farther south, near Virginia, but storms and navigational problems pushed them northward, toward the coast of present-day Massachusetts, where they eventually founded Plymouth Colony. What the settlers could not possibly understand at that moment was that they had unknowingly established their settlement directly beside and partially atop the ruins of Patuxet itself. The cleared land they used for planting had once belonged to indigenous families. The open fields they interpreted as providential opportunity existed only because epidemic disease had already devastated the region years earlier. Inside Plymouth, conditions deteriorated with terrifying speed. People died constantly during the winter of 1620 and 1621, forcing survivors to bury bodies quietly beneath frozen ground, while trying to hide the scale of their losses from surrounding indigenous communities whose intentions they still feared and barely understood. Among the leaders struggling to keep the colony alive was William Bradford, while the military officer Miles Standish increasingly focused on defense as uncertainty surrounding the indigenous world outside Plymouth continued growing. By the time spring finally approached in 1621, nearly half the original passengers aboard the Mayflower were dead, and somewhere beyond the forests surrounding Plymouth, Massasoit and other indigenous leaders were already watching carefully, trying to decide whether those starving foreigners represented weakness or the beginning of something much larger. For the survivors inside Plymouth, the arrival of spring in 1621 did not immediately bring relief. The settlement remained fragile. Food was still uncertain. disease still lingered, and beyond the edges of the colony stretched forests filled with people whose intentions the English still could not read. Then something happened that none of them expected. One morning, an indigenous man suddenly walked into Plymouth and greeted them in English. "Welcome, Englishmen." His name was Samoset. Imagine the shock of that moment. Men who only months earlier had crossed an ocean believing they were entering an unknown wilderness suddenly found themselves staring at someone from that same land, speaking their language back to them. Some were likely stunned, others suspicious. A few probably feared a trap. But Samoset's arrival changed the atmosphere inside Plymouth almost immediately. Because for the first time since reaching New England, the colonists realized communication with the indigenous world around them might actually be possible. And only days later, Samoset returned with another man, Tisquantum. Unlike Samoset, whose English had been learned gradually through contact with fishermen farther north, Tisquantum spoke with remarkable fluency after years spent in Europe and among English traders. For men like William Bradford, the appearance of someone like Squanto must have felt almost impossible. An indigenous survivor from the same coastline, fluent in English, familiar with Europe, and capable of explaining the political world surrounding Plymouth in ways nobody inside the settlement could possibly understand alone. Very quickly, the survival of Plymouth became tied to him. Tisquantum taught the settlers how to plant corn successfully in New England soil, using fish beneath the earth as fertilizer, showed them better fishing locations, and helped them navigate a landscape that still felt foreign and dangerous to the English colonists. But the most important thing he offered Plymouth was not food, it was diplomacy. Because outside the settlement, Massasoit was still calculating. The Wampanoag sachem understood that the arrival of the English created both danger and opportunity inside a region already weakened by epidemic disease. The Narragansett to the south remained powerful. And although the English settlers looked weak after the catastrophic winter, their weapons, ships, and growing presence suggested they might eventually become useful allies, or dangerous enemies. Tisquantum stood directly between those worlds. He translated negotiations, explained intentions, carried messages, and helped build the fragile alliance between Plymouth and Massasoit that allowed the colony to survive its earliest years. But as the English became increasingly dependent on him, something else also began changing beneath the surface. Tisquantum himself was becoming powerful. Winter had left marks on everyone. Some colonists still walked slowly between the wooden structures of Plymouth, carrying on their faces the exhaustion of people who had spent months burying friends, wives and children beneath frozen ground. Many slept hungry. Many truly believed they would die on that coastline before another spring arrived. And perhaps that was exactly what made that moment feel so unusual. Because, for the first time since the arrival of the Mayflower, there was enough food. The cornfields had finally grown. The rivers had begun giving fish once again. Wampanoag hunters brought deer into the settlement. Wild birds cooked above open fires, while the smell of smoke, roasted corn, and rendered fat drifted through Plymouth beneath the cold New England wind. Pumpkins cooked slowly beside the flames. Dried corn became simple breads and thick porridge. Fish and shellfish covered rough wooden tables built only for necessity. There were no luxurious feasts. There was no modern Thanksgiving. There were only people surviving. Men and women who only months earlier believed they would never see another summer now shared food. Beside peoples who had known that land long before their arrival, and standing quietly at the center of that transformation, was Squanto, a man who had lost his village, his people, his world, and who still chose to teach starving strangers how to survive. For a few brief days, Plymouth no longer felt like a colony standing at the edge of collapse. Laughter returned beneath the cold winds of New England. Children ran between barrels, fires, and piles of dried corn. English muskets fired into the air during games and celebration. Wampanoag warriors watched everything with caution, curiosity, and distance, because nobody there could possibly know what those alliances would bring in the decades to come. But in that brief moment, after so much death, survival itself already felt like reason enough to give thanks. as Plymouth slowly stabilized during the following months. The relationship between the English settlers and the surrounding indigenous nations became increasingly delicate. What had begun as a fragile alliance for survival gradually turned into something far more politically complicated. The settlers depended heavily on Tisquanum, sometimes too heavily. He translated negotiations, guided trade discussions, and explained regional rivalries in ways the English still could not understand alone. At the same time, neighboring indigenous communities increasingly realized that this unusual Patuxet survivor possessed direct influence over the foreigners now establishing themselves permanently along the coast. And Tisquanum himself appears to have understood exactly how valuable that position made him. Historical accounts suggest he occasionally used his connection to the English to strengthen his own authority among indigenous groups, sometimes exaggerating English military power or implying greater influence over Plymouth than he truly possessed. Whether those actions reflected ambition, survival instinct, or simply the calculations of a man trying to navigate an impossible political reality is difficult to know. But one person seems to have become increasingly uncomfortable with Tisquanum's growing independence. Massasoit, the Wampanoag sachem, had entered the alliance with Plymouth for strategic reasons, not sentimentality. The region remained unstable after years of epidemic disease. The Narragansett still represented a serious military concern, and as English settlements slowly strengthened along the Atlantic coast, Massasoit had every reason to remain cautious about anyone gaining too much influence between his people and the colonists, especially someone like Tisquanum, a man without a surviving Patuxet community behind him, a man deeply tied to the English world, a man capable of moving between civilizations in ways very few others could. Tension quietly began building beneath the alliance, and it was during that uneasy period that one of the most mythologized moments in early American history took place. The gathering, later remembered as the First Thanksgiving. In later centuries, paintings and schoolbooks transformed that moment into a peaceful symbol of friendship between settlers and indigenous peoples. But the reality surrounding it had always been far more uncertain. The English celebrated survival after a catastrophic winter. The Wampanoag observed a foreign settlement successfully establishing itself inside a region already devastated by disease. Massasoit participated because maintaining the alliance still carried political value. And somewhere between all of them stood Tisquanum, a man who understood more clearly than almost anyone there how fragile the balance between those worlds truly was. Because beneath the shared meal, diplomacy and temporary cooperation, something much larger was already beginning along the Atlantic coast. English settlements were surviving. More ships would come, and the world Tisquanum once knew was already changing forever. By the end of 1622, only a short time after Plymouth survived its earliest and most fragile years, Tisquanum suddenly became gravely ill during a diplomatic and trading journey, somewhere along the coast of present-day Massachusetts. The exact illness remains uncertain. Colonial accounts describe fever accompanied by severe bleeding from the nose, while his condition reportedly worsened rapidly over only a few days until it became clear that the man who had crossed oceans, survived captivity, and walked between civilizations was dying far from the place where his life had first begun. For the English colonists around him, the moment carried enormous weight. Men, like William Bradford, understood how deeply Plymouth depended on Tisquanum's knowledge, diplomacy, and ability to communicate between worlds that still barely trusted one another. Without him, the fragile relationship between Plymouth and the surrounding indigenous nations suddenly looked far less certain. According to Bradford's later writings, Tisquanum asked those near him to pray that he might go to the English God in heaven. It is one of the final details history preserved about him. And then he died. Tisquanum was likely buried somewhere near the coast of New England, though the exact location of his grave remains unknown today. Much like many parts of his life that survive only through fragmented colonial accounts written by people who never fully understood the world he came from. But history continued moving rapidly after his death. Plymouth survived. More English ships crossed the Atlantic. More settlements spread across New England. Roads, farms, and towns slowly expanded into territories that had once belonged entirely to indigenous nations whose political worlds already existed long before. Europeans imagined permanent colonies there, and although Tisquanum did not live long enough to witness the full transformation of New England, he had already seen enough to understand something many around him still could not fully grasp. The arrival of the English was not temporary. A civilization had crossed the Atlantic, and it intended to stay. That understanding gives an entirely different weight to the role Tisquanum played during Plymouth's earliest years, because he was not simply helping lost foreigners survive inside an unfamiliar wilderness. He was standing inside the beginning of a transformation that would permanently alter the future of North America itself. In the centuries that followed, the story of Plymouth Colony gradually became one of the foundational myths of the United States. Paintings, schoolbooks, and public memory transformed the colony into a symbolic beginning, a place where perseverance, faith, and cooperation supposedly gave birth to a new society in North America. And over time, the Thanksgiving story became one of the most recognizable parts of that mythology, repeated generation after generation, until many people began imagining the relationship between the English settlers and the indigenous peoples of New England as something simpler and more peaceful than it truly was. But the real world surrounding Plymouth had always been far more complicated. For a brief moment, around the fires of Plymouth, two worlds managed to cooperate for survival. But history did not stop there. More ships crossed the Atlantic. More settlements spread across New England. Forests slowly became towns, and indigenous nations that had once controlled the coastline watched the balance of the continent begin changing forever. That does not erase the reality of the first Thanksgiving, but it changes the way we understand it. Because the gathering remembered, centuries later, was not simply a story of friendship, nor purely a story of conquest. It was a fragile moment, suspended between diplomacy, survival, uncertainty, and the beginning of a transformation that neither side could fully control anymore. And standing at the center of that moment was a man who had already lost almost everything before the Mayflower ever arrived. A Patuxet man, born along the Atlantic coast, kidnapped into the growing Atlantic world, transported across the ocean, exposed to slavery, Europe, and the English language, returned home to discover that disease had erased his people, and eventually became one of the key figures responsible for helping Plymouth survive long enough to establish itself permanently in New England. That is what makes the story of Tisquanum so haunting centuries later. Not because it represents a perfect story of harmony between civilizations, but because it reveals how the birth of colonial America was shaped by survival, loss, diplomacy, adaptation, and people forced to navigate worlds changing faster than anyone fully understood. Before there was a United States, before New England became associated with English towns and colonial history, and before Thanksgiving became an American tradition, there was already a man from the Patuxet people standing at the collision point between two worlds that would permanently transform the future of North America. His name was Tisquanum. The English called him Squanto, and his story was far larger than the myth most people remember today. If you enjoy stories about forgotten people shaped by the early Americas, subscribe to Primordial Lands.